And welcome back and good morning, Belize. I am currently in Washington, D.C., where for this special exclusive interview with Lord Michael Ashcroft. Good morning.
Good
Thank
morning,
you for
ma'am.
taking the time to sit down and talk with me.
Delighted. It's been a long time.
It has been. And in fact, there are quite a number of issues that I wanted to be able to get some clarity on in regards to your business interests and several other national issues. But let me start off by saying the last time I had a report on you, it was on your health status. And I know you had quite a terrible health scare. How are you doing at this time?
Well, now, fortunately, I'm through it, but I wouldn't recommend septic shock to anyone. I was in intensive care for 19 days initially, back in hospital for 3 further occasions, and it was 5 months before I was able to make my first public appointment. And what has been surprising to me is how little people know about sepsis or septic shock. And the one little tip that I would give to people is, if you're not feeling very well, but one of those, I'll push myself through this, just watch for one sign, and that is, if you haven't peed for 12 hours, that is often a sign that your kidneys are failing, which is one of the first signs of sepsis. And if that happens, go see your doctor. But I'm in fine form and fettle now, and I'm very pleased to be back.
Well, I appreciate the fact that the experience has taught you to be an advocate, especially for men, to access healthcare. So you're also currently in Washington, D.C., doing some business, which is why we got the opportunity to sit down and talk with you. Tell me a bit about what you're doing here.
Well, since there's been a change from the Democrats to the Republicans, then of course I'm a conservative right of center. And so many of the people that I've known over many years have started to get appointments within the Trump administration. And I'm catching up on meeting a number of those people, whether they be people directly within the administration or those who may have other appointments. And so it's refreshing to catch up and to see what's going on. And it also gives me an opportunity in certain quarters to talk about Belize. For example, it's becoming well known on things like correspondent banking problems within the whole of the Caribbean area. But I will be in Washington every month now in order to follow up on quite a few of those contacts.
Okay. All right. So let's get into some of the issues that I wanted to discuss. First of all, the BTL nationalization settlement. The meeting that took place in Miami with yourself and Prime Minister Dean Barrow has been one that we've only been able to get the information or the details of the settlement from the Prime Minister himself. Now, my question is it starts with the timeline. It had been a very long time before you were able to get to the point to reach the settlement. How did the meeting in Miami first come about?
Well, I think, first of all, in any conflict, whether it's a civil action, whether it's even in acts of war, there are always issues that both sides have in common, even if they're in conflict. Mm-hmm. And often that is to either settle something or agree a modus that's in both parties' interest. Mm-hmm. So the meeting in Miami, which I notice some of the media say was a secret meeting, was in fact mentioned by the Prime Minister himself when he came back. So it was hardly a secret meeting, but a lovely media term. And so part of that at the time was that we were awaiting the decision of the Caribbean Court of Justice as to whether the nationalization was constitutional or not, or what the consequences of that would be. And so there was a litigation risk on both sides as to how that would turn out to be. And mutually, the government of Belize and the shareholders of Telemedia thought that a settlement on satisfactory terms to both sides would be far better than the lottery of waiting for a legal judgment. And that was simply the background to that particular one.
So there was no extension of an olive branch from either side?
Well, in any settlement, you could say that it's a mutual olive branch offering to each other to find some arrangement that is satisfactory to all sides.
Now, the settlement, as was agreed to in Miami, has been called primarily by the opposition, a blank check to yourself, to the group of companies, based on the costs that are still yet to be defined. How do you?
Well, first of all, may I just correct you on
Yeah.
one thing? Is you used the words "to me."
Yeah.
I was not a shareholder in Telemedia. And I think it's important, just to go back a little bit on the history. At one time, my company, Carlyle, which is a public company, was the majority shareholder of BTL. And at that time, if you'll recall, another telephone company started called Intelco. And there were suspicions that there were people who shouldn't have financial interests in Intelco did so. And I caused a bit of a fuss about it at the time. I felt this was unfair. And that led to the government wanting to purchase my shares in BTL. And I agreed on certain terms and conditions to sell my shares to the government. The government in turn found another buyer that they believed was more amenable to themselves, and that was a gentleman by the name of Mr. Prosser. Mr. Prosser negotiated terms and conditions which was his accommodation agreement. However, the government of Belize found Mr. Prosser couldn't pay. So now they were in a dilemma that they had given control to Mr. Prosser but hadn't got the money. So they came back to me and asked me, could I find a solution to this? I didn't want to own BTL again. So I said that what I'd be prepared to do was to set up a company, the majority of which would be a trust for the benefit of the people of Belize. And around 25% would be for the benefit of the employees, and that we would deal with Mr. Prosser. And that happened, and we were able to exit Mr. Prosser. The so-called accommodation agreement was no more or no less than the terms that the government had already agreed to give to Mr. Prosser, or had already given to Mr. Prosser. And the purpose of it was to borrow the money, to buy the shares, to reorganize it quickly, and to find an international buyer. And so the cost of those shares was somewhere between 100 and 120 million US dollars at that time. But the accommodation agreement was an integral part. We managed to obtain an offer from an international telephone company, Cable and Wireless, for over $300 million. But it needed the government to agree that purchase. And that then fell into problems that the government decided that they didn't like the accommodation agreement. Had that agreement gone ahead, there would have been a profit of over 200 million US dollars that would have been converted into Belize dollars for the benefit of Belizean charities and the employees. The problem has now been that because it has taken 7 years in order to get to a point of compensation, and now with funding interest, there is very little profit that has been left. And I think it has been a very sad case of what has happened through the particular process.
This is the reason why it was a very interesting development when the government of Belize, or the Prime Minister, decided to settle the nationalization issue after prolonged litigation. For a very long time, this has been seen as a very personal issue between yourself and Prime Minister Dean Barrow. And understanding that there was this turn of events at a certain point in time has been something that people just can't quite understand.
Well, I could give my view on that, but it wouldn't be particularly flattering to the Prime Minister. And I really don't want to make this a personal matter. The Prime Minister has made it quite a personal matter with me, but I would prefer to resist that temptation. But I believe that the government made a strategic mistake in not allowing that accommodation agreement, which in effect, most of the terms of that accommodation agreement have run through under current government ownership, and they've had control of the company. But it's a sad saga. The government decided that they didn't want to become involved in the arbitration. So having had as a term that there was a treaty that arbitration would be through the London courts, then not participating in the arbitration has meant that this is dragged on and on and on far more than it really should have done. But the important point is that I have no interest in the shares of Telemedia. So having a little pop at me is having a pop at the messenger, not the actual facts of the matter.
So let's outline what was agreed to in Miami, specifically.
Well, it was more general. It was we wanted a settlement, and there were some broad terms that were agreed. Then at that particular point, it then goes to the lawyers on both sides. And from the government of Belize's side, they had not only the input of a major US law firm, they had the eminent Belizean Dennis Barrow, and I think Dean's own firm, Barrow and Williams, were involved in the drafting of the contract. And of course, the Prime Minister himself is a very able and competent lawyer. So you had the government team then doing all the detailed paperwork for the contract that finally emerged. And that was then went to the House, and the House approved it, and that is the contract to which both sides have to adhere.
And the settlement was primarily over loss of compensation and the cost or the actual value of the company itself.
Yes, it was what was the value of the company at the date of nationalization. And then what happens in that process, the government employs its expert, the shareholders of Telemedia employ their expert, and it goes to arbitration, and the arbiters then decide what is a fair price, and then both parties had agreed that whatever that decision was, they would respect it.
Now, the reason I'm pressing you on why the specific details or what the specific details of the agreement was is that we're now at a juncture where we're talking about, in general terms, we call it the arbitration awards, but included in that is a part of the accommodation agreement from the BTL issue. Why was that not a part of the settlement at that time? Why not take the opportunity? You're both at the table. This has been an outstanding issue for so many years to perhaps work towards a solution to that end.
Well, there was. If you go and get the contract, it says quite clearly that this is the arbitration award of the value of the company, and then from that amount is deducted all the liabilities of the trust that purchased the shares in the first place, the interest, legal costs and everything else. And then at the end of the day, there's a division payable in Belize dollars, which will be used for charitable purposes in Belize. But that sum eventually will not be a substantial sum as a percentage of the whole because of the liabilities that I've just mentioned that have been incurred in the last 7 or 8 years, both of the cost of the original shares, all the legal actions and the interest that's been accrued since that particular day.
Now, we're going to go ahead and take a very quick break, but when we come back, we're going to be touching on one of the more recent developments in terms of your business interests, and that's looking at what's taking place in the U.S. courts when it comes to your arbitral awards. So we're going to go ahead and take a break, and when we come back, that's the next topic for our conversation. Stay tuned. And welcome back, and we're continuing our exclusive interview with Lord Michael Ashcroft as we move into what has been one of the more recent developments when it comes to your business interests in Belize, and that is the outstanding arbitral awards and your efforts to be able to enforce them. Now, this is also a very long-standing issue. It is also a very legal issue. It has moved through the Belize courts, the UK courts, and now the U.S. courts. So I want us to be able to differentiate the difference between the awards and the genesis of those awards, and also to be very clear from the beginning, your own personal business interests in these awards. So the BSDL, Belize Social Development Limited Arbitration Award. Let's start with that one.
I am not a shareholder in that. The principal shareholders are the Hayward Charitable Trust and the Employees Trust of BTL. The Carlisle one is in which I do have a financial interest through my shareholding in Carlisle, but that is a public company that has a few thousand shareholders within it. The other one, the genesis, is the UHS one, which is a bank deal from the Belize Bank, which I clearly have an interest in. And of course, we've just discussed Telemedia, in which I've explained that I have no financial interest in the share capital of the plaintiff in that particular one. That's the Hayward Charitable Trust for the benefit of Belizeans, and the Employees Trust.
What I want to do is to be able to separate the awards and talk about their genesis and the litigation process so far, as well as to be able to clearly define your own personal business interests in these awards. So let's start with the BSDL award, which is the Belize Social Development Limited Award.
Well, I have no personal interest in the share capital of BSDL. The shareholders of BSDL are the original shareholders of Telemedia. So that is the Hayward Charitable Trust, and then the Employees Trust are the owners of that arbitration award.
And going back, this is what we were speaking about before the break in terms of looking at how the agreements went to arbitration. Now, this goes back to 2009, I believe.
Sadly.
With the decision to go to the LCIA, the London Court of International Arbitration. The government of Belize made a decision at that point to not represent themselves in that particular litigation process. And it ruled in favor of the trust at that point. Take us from that point, what you've had to do to be able to try to get to the point of enforcement.
Well, once the London Court of International Arbitration had made the award, it was then up to BSDL as to how it wanted to go forward to enforce the award. And in that particular case, BSDL decided to go straight to the New York courts under the New York Convention, which if you get an arbitration award in one country, you can enforce it in another. So BSDL went to the American courts, and it was at that point that the government of Belize challenged it at every stage through the initial courts, the appeal courts, and in fact even attempted to get it to the Supreme Court. And then eventually the award was made to BSDL, and that's where it lies at the moment.
And recently, the ruling that has come through the U.S. Supreme Court in terms of the appeal made by government, it's called certiorari that they submitted.
Well, that was their application to go to the Supreme Court, but in the United States, it's not automatic that every case goes to the Supreme Court. They judge whether it's unique on its merits, or is in the national interest of the U.S., or its relationships with foreign governments. But they decided that the Court of Appeal level was sufficient, and they refused to take the case to the Supreme Court. So at the moment, BSDL sits on an order which gives it permission to move to the next stage to effect enforcement.
What are your options for the judgment to be enforced?
Well, that's for BSDL to decide how they're going to take it forward. But there was a bit of an overreaction by the government of Belize in terms of talking about attacking Belize's reserves. The law in the United States makes it quite clear that you cannot go after a sovereign nation's foreign currency reserves. So I think that rhetoric was to get the crowd a little bit uptight, as if somebody was going after the trade of the whole of Belize, bringing economic collapse and all the rest of it. But we'll leave that to one side.
I'm going to want to take some time to talk about the recent amendment to the Central Bank Act and the Immunities Act. But to go back to staying on track with the award. So BSDL at this point is at the point of figuring out its next step for enforcement.
That's correct.
And as you were alluding to, it is not an action that will lead to seizing. It isn't even legally possible to be able to seize.
Or negotiation. Yeah. It doesn't necessarily mean enforcement. You've seen, we've discussed in the first segment, that Telemedia comes to a particular point where both sides sit down and say, how do we resolve this? And so that is always open at any time during any litigation for both sides to say, can we find a way through this that's satisfactory to both parties? And BSDL is always open to having that dialogue. If it's a matter that the government has difficulty paying it in US dollars, because that one, for example, is for the benefit of Belizean people and employees, could be in Belize dollars. It could be deferred for a number of years. All those are the basis of a negotiation.
Now, there is an interesting aspect of this, the seeking of the enforcement of this award. The it moved through the Belize courts all the way up to...
BSDL has not gone through the Belize courts.
BSDL has not gone through CCJ.
It went straight from the British courts, the seat of the arbitration, the seat where both the government of Belize agreed arbitration should be held, and it has gone for enforcement in the United States and gone through the US process.
So let's move on to the CIHL award.
That I do clearly have an interest because I'm a major shareholder in CIHL, which also has probably two or three other thousand shareholders as well, and is a publicly listed company.
Caribbean Investment Holding Limited, formerly BCB.
That's the one.
Okay. So let's talk about the genesis of that award.
Well, the genesis of that one, part of it goes back to the original Telemedia and the sale to Prosser and during that period of time. And it's important to understand that this was a settlement agreement in which Carlyle agreed to waive certain claims that it had on the government and release it from some of the warranties that were given by the government, and in return were given certain tax concessions. And that was then challenged by the government and went right the way up to the Caribbean Court of Justice. But one of the clauses within that settlement agreement was that the government of Belize would take all necessary steps to effect that agreement. And what the Caribbean Court of Justice said is that the government failed to put it through to the House of Representatives. And on that particular basis, they couldn't enforce it. So because it's a London award, Carlyle does have the option of enforcing it in any jurisdiction. So though the Belize courts may say it is against public policy, we've shown that in the US courts and the UK courts, they've taken a different view on public policy. So that one sits now that Carlyle does have the permission of the courts of the US to take it to the next stage. Now, where it goes from here, we don't know, and Carlyle will discuss that with its advisors as to where to go. And or at some point, there may be some sensible discussion with the government of Belize in order to compromise it and get it out of the way. But who knows what the future holds.
So you would be willing to settle?
I have always said that on all these cases, there's always a willingness to find a settlement. And I'm a great believer in compromise, and I'm a great believer in the old Chinese expression that you always give the other person face. In other words, you don't try to humiliate one side or the other.
Now you have spoken, you touched very briefly on the CCJ's ruling. Now this has been a point that the Prime Minister has been trying to emphasize when speaking about these awards, that essentially any attempt to be able to enforce these awards, in Belize through the Belize courts were denied, all the way up to the Caribbean Court of Justice. That is our highest court in Belize. And in the ruling that the CCJ gave, they said that they simply could not be able to allow for enforcement because of the illegalities of the agreement itself.
No, they never ever said, this is political rhetoric again, they never said the agreement was illegal. Political rhetoric. They said that it couldn't be enforced because it didn't go through the House. The government had agreed in the settlement agreement to take all steps to ensure that it was legally enforceable. The government failed to do so, and then they have been able to use that subsequently to avoid payment. So Carlisle honoured in the settlement agreement all its side of the bargain and has had no redress, whilst the government of Belize has been able to avoid the payment side of that settlement agreement. And the courts of the United Kingdom and the United States have disagreed with the verdict of the court of Belize. So
On the issue of public policy.
on the issue of all issues. And they have heard in the United States, the government has made all these arguments about the Caribbean Court of Justice. They've given to the US courts all the transcripts or whatever they believed was appropriate for the government of Belize to present their case, and it has been rejected.
Let's move on to the Belize Bank loan note award. And this is one that we know you do have an interest in. And the genesis of this particular award stems from the very contentious UHS deal.
Well, first of all, the UHS deal was the Development Finance Corporation, the government of Belize, lent money to UHS. And they borrowed that money from the Belize Bank. And it came to a point where UHS was not able to pay. But the government wanted more money lent to UHS. And they approached the Belize Bank. The Belize Bank agreed to lend more money on condition that the government itself guaranteed the obligations of DFC. A very straightforward commercial request. Subsequently, the government found a way that it paid off that debt. And if you'll recall, some of the money came from Taiwan and some of the money came from Venezuela. Then the government, after having settled the UHS, then laid down a claim to say that the Venezuela money should not have been used to settle the UHS one. And they were able to procure, the central bank and through the courts, were able to recover that part of the money from the Belize Bank, which then meant the Belize Bank was out of pocket. So the Belize Bank took that to arbitration, and it won. So that is the genesis of that one.
Yes.
And the unfortunate thing, because of the amount of it, is because it was it has accrued penalty interest. So the amount of that, as more time goes on, gets more and more and more.
It's more than doubled at this
It's more
point.
double. But the bottom line is the Belize Bank did lend the money. The Belize Bank is out of pocket, and the government has refused to pay. It's as simple as that.
Now, I asked you previously with the other award whether you'd be willing to settle. Is that the case for this award as well? Or are you seeking full compensation?
I think you can take it that for anything of which I either have a financial interest or for those that I've represented in the negotiations, there's always a willingness to settle. There's always a willingness, but it has to be one that is fair to both sides. It can't be one of saying, the government has had advantage of all these things and merely doesn't want to pay.
Now, Lord Ashcroft, once again, you've been vilified by the government of Belize for going after these awards specifically at this time when the economy is the way it is. And it has been one of the issues, I believe, that in all the statements made by the Prime Minister, most of the statements made by the Prime Minister or others, the question is, why now? Look at the recession the country is facing, the magnitude of these awards, and you are a Belizean citizen who speaks very fondly of the country and your love for Belize. How do you explain that?
Well, first of all, most of these are not of my making. And secondly, they've been going on for 7 or 8 years. Is it the fault of these people that this government has run the economy into the ground at this particular stage? Is it because the government has got itself into this mess, that has wasted the Petro-Carib money, that has mishandled the bond negotiations, and now finds itself in economic problems with its economy contracting? But irrespective of that, this could have been settled a long time ago. But irrespective of that, it can still be on offer to defer this over a number of years in the future to take the pressure off Belize. But if somebody actually owes you sums of money and says, well, I now can't pay it, will you just write it off? Tough call.
Yeah.
Tough call. I think there should be a proper sit down. And what the government is doing is what we in campaigning call the dead cat strategy. Is when they're losing basically the argument or the cases, you throw something else onto the fire to arouse the passions of people or the electorate. And in this particular case, it's very easy to come to the type of question that you've just asked without going back into the history of the matter and saying, should the government be in the position it is now on these issues? Could it have handled it differently? Should it have compromised it years and years and years ago and let it, rather than let it fester to where it is today? Was the nationalisation really in the national interest at the time? Was it? So all these factors make a very complex scenario. But if the government wanted to sit down and find some longer term solution to all these matters, I would be the first to be sitting there to be able to discuss it.
Mm-hmm. So you were willing, as you've pointed out several times, not only to settle but also to defer?
Of course.
Okay. Now, looking at the one of the issues that has spun off from this, and that has been the persecution, I would call it, of Senator Courtney. He has been challenged by the Prime Minister, by the government, for his role in being a part of your legal counsel and for seeking these awards. What are your thoughts on this particular attack?
Well, first of all, you have to, in any democracy, everyone has the right to legal representation in a democracy, whether it's a civil case, whether it's a criminal case, whether it's a murderer, has a right to legal representation. And once you start accusing people that they shouldn't represent certain people, you're starting to tread on some dangerous ground. Now, where Senator Courtney is concerned, yes, he is a senator. But the job he's doing in the Senate at the moment is quite remarkable. He is exposing enormous corruption within the immigration department, the issuing of passports, false registration for the elections, visa problems, and so on and so forth, and is doing an excellent job. And it's not difficult to understand why those who don't wish him to pursue that would prefer him not to be in the Senate and would throw up many reasons that he shouldn't be. And I have told Senator Courtney that it's more important for him as a citizen of Belize to continue that role in the Senate in exposing what he is doing at the moment than acting for the constitutional claim. That can be done by other lawyers. And if Mr. Courtney feels that his seat is under pressure because he is handling that constitutional claim, my advice to Mr. Courtney is you just continue to do that good job for the people of Belize.
Mm-hmm. Now, Senator Courtney also called into question whether or not the Prime Minister and his firm has shares in CIHL. Can you confirm this?
Off the top of my head, from years and years ago, I believe the firm of Barrow and Williams, who still represents the bank to this day, does have a few shares, but the amount is insignificant, and it is not one that I believe should be used by his opponents against him.
Okay. Now let's move on to the recent amendments that have been brought before the courts, and this ties very closely into the issues of seeking enforcement of these judgments. The Central Bank of Belize International Immunities Act and the Crown Proceedings Amendment Act. As you pointed out, there is a current constitutional challenge regarding these specific acts. The question I have is, it has been deemed as unnecessary, simply as you pointed out earlier, that a company or a business interest cannot go after your federal reserves. But the Prime Minister said that this is additional protection to ensure that you or any other business interest can be able to do so. So let's talk about whether or not you think the amendments were necessary to be able to do so.
Well, this is like a repeat of history. A few years ago, the government passed the I always have a difficulty pronouncing this one, so excuse me, viewers, for this one. They passed a very similar act which made criminal penalties. And it took nearly 2 years to get that to the Caribbean Court of Justice, to get it overturned, which then brought the government of Belize back to the negotiating table on the Telemedia matter. I believe in this particular one, they've used very similar words to which the Caribbean Court of Justice has already overturned as unconstitutional. My belief is that the government is aware that they have passed something which is unconstitutional, but with the hope and expectation that this manages to defer the day when the awards can be enforced with the threat of criminal sanctions. And so that is the process which is now going through. And it's not just ourselves, it's the firm of Courtney and Coy are a part of separate action here, because there are within that law where there are acts which you have done before the enactment that were not criminal at that time are brought into it. So the uncertainty to the citizen retroactive is unconstitutional. The penalties are out of proportion. Ad hominem, it's clearly aimed at me. You just have to have a look at the transcripts of the House to be able to see that. So we've been through this path before, and I think the government is just wanting to play for further time. And that's really unnecessary to the extent that you actually have. So if we've waited 7 years, if we have to wait another couple of years or so, if the government doesn't want to settle or compromise or negotiate on this. Meanwhile, interest is accruing at all different rates of interest. Now,
in the House, when Prime Minister introduced these acts, it was actually put forward to be able to prevent any possibility of you going after assets, specifically the foreign reserves. But there was also something very important that he said in the House that day, which is any act to be able to, any effort, I should say, to go after Belize's assets in the United States, which he says we don't have, he considers an act of economic war?
It's a free country. Whatever you say in Parliament is covered by privilege. You can disagree with it if you wish to do so. I regard that as political rhetoric under all the circumstances.
How would you ideally want to see, given the context, and it is a political issue, but it is also an issue of great concern for Belizeans. These awards in the United Kingdom and in the U.S. courts have been approved, agreed to. The economy of Belize, and we're going to talk about the super bond and some of the issues in just a bit, is definitely not in the position to be able, we're restructuring the super bond for a third time. There are no funds to be able to allow for these judgments to be enforced. How would you, on all these contexts, would like to see a solution to these?
Just to sit down and simply negotiate a deal over a period of time. It can be over many years. Mm-hmm. It doesn't have to be something that is immediate. Mm-hmm. But you can't get to that point unless the other side is prepared or wants to sit down and talk. Mm-hmm. You know, negotiations, they are a two-way street, not a one-way street. And so I can, as I've regularly done, said that I'm happy to be able to sit down and find something that's in the long-term interests of Belize to settle these disputes. But there is enormous validity. You don't get arbitration awards if you have no case. So there is a case that these sums of money, do have an award. The fact that the highest court in Belize, the CCJ, said that the government of Belize failed to put it through the House. But it makes you wonder how many other contracts have not gone to the House. I can't recall, for example, maybe you can, when they gave away the airport in Belize to the private sector. I can't recall it going through the House. Maybe it did. I can't recall seeing details of that contract. Maybe you did, I didn't. I'm sure if I were really to search my mind on how many contracts haven't gone through the House, that lie there unchallenged. And I think potential investors to Belize certainly need to be quite cautious in agreements they make with the government if public policy on taxation matters means it needs House approval.
Well, that's exactly one of the issues we'll be looking at in just a few. I got to go ahead and take a break. And when we come back, we'll be looking at issues regarding the economy. Stay tuned. And welcome back. And we are continuing our exclusive interview with Lord Michael Ashcroft. And of course, we are here in Washington, D.C. And there's several issues that I wanted to be able to tap into your thoughts on. And I want to start off with what is a very important issue for us at home, and that is the restructuring of the super bond, the third restructuring of the super bond. Now, I know you're very well aware of the situation as it is, and currently, the government of Belize has decided, or at this point, has not paid the payment due on February 21st, given the holiday. And there is a grace period of 30 days that they say that the bondholders have the opportunity to agree to this final proposal. However, we have not at this point had any response from bondholders that seem to be positive. The Prime Minister says after his last meeting that he's still optimistic, but it's still very unknown what will happen next. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, first of all, from the bondholders' point of view, this is the third restructuring. So it's not difficult to understand how they must feel having gone through a couple of restructurings before, and that all the economic forecasts made at the times when they agreed to restructure have failed to materialize. So they must be thinking, oh no, not again. Now, I would expect that what they're doing at the moment is fairly routine. they're saying, I would suspect, that we must have better guarantees this time, that there's not going to be a fourth one coming down the line. Therefore, we would like an IMF program in place to ensure that there is a better chance that we get our money. That, of course, from the government's point of view, is very difficult. That merely confirms that the economy has got to a particular point where you need to call in the IMF, and that has political consequences. Failing that, you'd expect them to say, well, okay, if it's not the IMF that monitors, what about we as the bondholders monitor the economy and have certain rights? That, again, for the government's point of view, is they don't particularly want bondholders to have any particular rights over the economy, the direction it holds, and as a condition of the restructuring. So there's a game of spoof that starts to get played, a dangerous game of spoof on both sides. The government clearly doesn't want to default, because that simply means that eventually the bondholders who hold the bonds will start to exit to the vulture funds of the United States, whose speciality is extracting funds from governments that have defaulted. And it took one vulture fund in the States 15 years to get their money out of Argentina. And so that's not where Belize wants to go. Its credit rating would be smashed in the international markets. The bondholders, from their point of view, don't want to take further losses. So, as in any negotiation, Belize will take advantage of the 30-day grace period, and then it will be at that stage whether the bondholders will just go forward or will say, okay, we've had enough. We actually believe that we're not going to agree this for the time being. Or they may even give Belize a longer period of time to discuss things. So it's a delicate and a difficult situation for both sides at the moment.
Now, some experts have suggested that perhaps restructuring the bond for a third time was a bad idea from the start. That perhaps this payment could have been met, and then looking at ways to improve the economy to be able to keep with the current schedule. What do you think of that?
Well, I mean, if the end of this negotiation is a default, then so long as Belize does not need access to any foreign market, then the saving of that interest could be used to either plow back into the economy or settle other debts and obligations that the government may have. There'll be a debt relief burden by default. But the government has chosen to confront the bondholders. They must have had some confidence from their advisors that the bondholders would blink first through this. Otherwise, why start a process if you know that the odds of landing up in default is what is going to happen? So I don't think at this stage anybody can say whether the strategy was right or wrong. If the bondholders blink, you could argue the strategy was correct. If they don't blink, you could argue the strategy didn't work out. So I think we just got to keep our fingers crossed that for the nation's sake, that we come out of this satisfactorily.
Now, the key issue here is looking once again at the economy, and we have been struggling for quite some time, looking at the debt burden that we have, looking at the weak economy, the social issues that we've been continuously facing, and we do have to meet our debt obligations. What are your thoughts? And I know, looking at what has been taking place in Belize for some time, there is the potential, and there have been talks of increased taxes at the next budget reading, and people are concerned. What are your thoughts in terms of how we can be able to move the economy forward?
Well, it's like that somebody in history once said, I wouldn't have started from here. I think in getting the economy moving and making the right steps for this government should have started the day they were elected, way back, however many years ago. It's very difficult to it means you have to say that the government has not done what it could have done. It hasn't done what it could have done on the Petro-Carib money, rather than in the main appears to be a lot of squandering of that money, but yet there's still now debt owed to Venezuela. And no doubt this government will be looking at ways of either reneging on that debt or finding some way for Venezuela to accept so many cents in the dollar for the debt. But no responsible government should be able to go through in borrowing money and then on a basis that we're not going to have to pay it back, or we're going to make sure these people have a haircut. It eventually gives Belize a bad name. So yes, the government is in trouble with the economy contracting at the moment, and if we were able to settle lots of these matters, not just the bonds, but all this international arbitration stuff, then we could all get on the same side and do things to create inward investment. But the point is that many people fail to realize that investment in a small country is by choice for foreign investors. The world is their oyster. They can invest in so many other countries. And if investors can't be assured that there's a sanctity of contract, if they can't be assured that every time the government changes, the next government tries to renegotiate or renege, then investment is going to become increasingly difficult within the country.
Mm-hmm. Now, speaking of investments, one of the issues that is being explored at this point is the privatization of the utility companies once again. Given your history with the telecoms industry in Belize and the subsequent nationalization that took place, what are your thoughts on this idea of moving forward? They've made very clear that they want to keep majority shares in the companies. But what are your thoughts in moving back to privatization?
Well, would you invest in a company that is a minority in a government-regulated business when you have seen what the government has done already, not just to Telemedia, but to Belize Electricity Company, that when things don't quite go their own way, and if I recall rightly, even the water company was privatized, and all the government guarantees were not fulfilled, and eventually they had to buy it back from the private sector, and I believe that was a British water company that actually bought it. It seems to me to be a difficult sell, unless, of course, they force Social Security Board to buy it. But I would suspect that even the Social Security Board might be a little wary, especially as at the moment it seems the Telemedia shares they were persuaded to buy seem to be underwater in valuation. But taking that valuation and taking the bondholders, the government of Belize has said that the price paid for Telemedia through this arbitration will turn out to be a good investment. So to solve the bond problem and to solve some of the foreign currency problems, why doesn't the government of Belize go to some international agent, one of the big investment banks, and put the whole of Telemedia up for sale to the highest foreign bidder? And if the Prime Minister is right about the value, you could solve the bond problem, you could solve the foreign currency problem, and you'd have professional expertise running the major telephone company in Belize.
Now, given your own personal issues that you faced with your investments, do you still have interest in future investments in Belize at this point in time?
Well, it's very difficult because if any future investment is going to be wrapped up with government hostility, then why would you start the path in the first place? And so, again, as I mentioned earlier, with the world as your oyster, why would you deliberately invest unless you had some real cast iron guarantees that whatever else you did would be ring-fenced from government attitude. So when you mentioned to me earlier, and I ducked the question about the Prime Minister saying it's economic war and everything's on the table, then that itself would be a deterrent, if you took it seriously, to wanting to do any further investment until all this is settled.
Now, at one point in time, you were spending quite a bit of time in Belize, returning and being able to enjoy the place that you call home. What is your current relationship at this point in time in going back home, in being able to check in on investments and that overall relationship?
Well, it's been very sad for 8 years. I have a great love for the country, but at the same time, love is something that has to be mutual. There's no point me staring in your eyes and telling you that I love you. If you're saying, well, hold on, Michael, I don't love you, that's not the basis of a relationship. So you've got to have one. And so I was ambassador for Belize at the United Nations. I would like to think that around the world, internationally, I could really help Belize. But with the current situation, it's very difficult. And I hope that the Prime Minister and I, who've always had, by the way, a cordial relationship when in private, I think we both have a mutual respect for each other on a personal level. We go back many, many years. He was my lawyer at the time. So I would hope we can find a way through it all.
I'm glad you brought up that point. You have spoken in previous interviews about the friendship that you once shared with the Prime Minister. And it is believed by the Belizean public that essentially the public feels the effects of whether or not things are good with your friendship or when things go awry, that we also feel the consequences. What is one, and we've spoken about this issue before, but what is one thing you would want the Belizean public to know and understand about you?
Well, that's a very difficult one in an arena of politics. I hoped that my legacy of rescuing the government of Belize from Mr. Prosser, of rescuing it at a sensible price and using all my expertise to extricate the country from that relationship and setting it up for the benefit of the people of Belize and for the employees would be something that I could look back on and feel proud that I was able to do and achieve. The fact it's turned out to be this debacle is one of the factors that I'm very depressed about.
All right. Well, in closing, I know that you have quite a bit of work that you're doing here in Washington. You are going to be doing a lecture on the Trump-Clinton election. Tell us a little bit about your thoughts on that. We know that you are a supporter of President Trump.
Well, I came here before the election and conducted 35 focus groups in the swing states here to try to find the attitude of people and how they would vote. And I did a 30,000 survey of why people voted the way they did, what their hopes were, what their fears were. And I wrote a small book on the American election explaining how we got to the position that President Trump became the president. And all that detailed work that I did. Then tomorrow morning I give a lecture to a worldwide group of center-right politicians from around the world of not only the phenomena of President Trump, but also the phenomena of the United Kingdom leaving the European Union. So I'm on duty tomorrow morning to be able to do that and continuing to meet people. I had a wonderful catch-up yesterday morning with the former Secretary of State, General Colin Powell, who I first met 20 years ago, bringing me up to speed of political events and what he's now doing. So it's been a catch-up of old friends, new people in the administration, lectures, and of course, the opportunity to come back again on Open Your Eyes.
All right. The DC edition, of course.
Of course.
Well, I appreciate you taking the time for sitting down with me today. And, of course, best of luck, and we hope to hear from you soon.
Always a delight.
All right.
Thank you.
And with that, we're going to go ahead and close off this exclusive interview with Lord Michael Ashcroft, and you guys can take it back in studio.